Welcome back to Unleashed with Marc Morano on TNT. All right, joining us now is geologist Dr. Gregory Wrightstone of the CO2 Coalition, the chairman, the executive director of that. Thank you for joining the program. He's also the author of a very convenient warming, how modest warming and more CO2 can benefit humanity. Thanks for coming on the program today, Greg.
Yeah, good to be back on with you again, Mark. It's always do such a good job here with this show.
All right, well, let's start with breaking news. The United Nations, according to the UK Guardian, and this article is just dated a couple days ago, May 9th, 2024. I put here, this time they really, really mean it. The UN is warning, Dr. Gregory Wrightstone, that the world is on the edge of a climate abyss, in quotes, and the stakes could not be higher. Top UN climate experts declare, quote, leaders must act radically, unquote. What is your response? Let's reverse the question. If we were actually facing this climate emergency, would our politicians acting radically somehow prevent that climate catastrophe?
Oh no. We've seen now 40 years, 30 years of one prediction failure after another. The fact of the matter is that they like summer because summer is the best time of year to be a climate alarmist with tornadoes, hurricanes. In a few months it'll be fires, and they do this and foment a climate of fear in order to have your viewers submit to their control strategy, trying to control every aspect of their lives.
So, but they just keep coming at us because it seems like the whole climate movement is they need fear in order to get people to go along with it. Let me ask you this. We have a whole coalition, it's been around for a while, of these young, I would call them, they call themselves young conservatives. I'm not convinced how conservative they are, but they claim, that that the young people, people like Benji Backer is leading organization, but they claim that young people are all concerned about climate and that the Republican Party is not addressing climate and the Republican Party will lose those votes. What they are seeking is the Republican Party to copy what's happening in Europe. And what's happening in Europe is the politicians accept the climate crisis and they agree on the premise and they all want to have solutions. They don't want to challenge any of the narrative of the science. Do you think that's a good idea to happen here in the U.S. in general? Few politicians who will, yeah, go ahead. What do you think of that strategy?
Oh, it's Benji Backer. There's a series of these that should be they're kind of erstwhile allies. We have Benji promoting conservative climate solutions. People like Bjorn Lomborg or Michael Schellenberger, they're doing good work, but they start with a failed premise. Their premise is there's a crisis and a problem that needs fixed. I don't give them an inch on that. There is no climate crisis. And they say, for example, Benji, he doesn't want to spend $3.5 trillion to solve the climate crisis. He just wants to spend $850 billion and do it wisely. I say, Benji, man, you got it wrong. Not one red cent, not one penny should be spent to solve this non-existent crisis. And because in my new book, A Very Convenient Warming, I go further than there is no climate crisis. We catalog and identify using science, facts, and data how our ecosystems are thriving and prospering tremendously. It's not by a little, it's by a lot, are benefiting, and the human condition and humanity is benefiting from modest warming and more CO2. It's, Mark, I call this the greatest untold story of the 21st century, that of a thriving Earth and benefits to humanity. Probably the greatest thing we can look at here is crop productivity that are breaking records year after year after year. And you can look at the top 8 crops in the world. I took a look at them in my book and found that they're breaking records from the warmest nations to the coldest nations year after year. Even the hot countries like India have crop growth records being broken. And so we're actually increasing food production faster than global population is expanding. And that's a good thing. We should celebrate how corn, soybeans, wheat, the other large crops in the world are expanding to feed that growing population. And it's because of warming, more CO2, and the use of nitrogen fertilizer that's derived from fossil fuels.
Yet if our viewers watch the mainstream media or listen to the United Nations, who, by the way, the UN spokesman actually says, we own the science on climate change. So we partnered with Google to make sure everyone knew it. In other words, they suppress any non-UN supported climate message. But essentially, the UN is still warning, climate activists are warning, John Kerry's warning, that unchecked climate change will lead to collapse of our food supply. But oddly, the climate agenda is going after nitrogen fertilizer and methane, which would essentially ration high-yield agriculture and ration meat eating. So is it the climate agenda that's the threat to food production, or is it climate change driven by our CO2? How do they have that? How do they reverse it? Yes. How are they saying that climate is going to collapse our food supply?
What they're talking about doing. They want to decrease CO2 instead of increase it. Here at the CO2 Coalition, we're huge proponents, as you know, of the many benefits of CO2, increasing CO2. And they're just not willing to, they don't have the science, the facts, and data on their side. We do. But they need to silence people like you and me and my fellow colleagues and scientists at the CO2 Coalition, because we tell a compelling story, and it's an interesting fact-based story. And I'm going to push back a little bit on you, Mark. I'm very optimistic. And as I travel around just meeting random people, I travel a lot. You travel a lot. I'm sure you're riding in an Uber here and there and everywhere.
Yes.
And I use Uber drivers. It used to be the taxi drivers, but now it's Uber drivers. It's a pretty good cross section of America, and almost to a T. Every single. Of course, I can't help myself. I have to start preaching to the Uber driver as we're riding, and to a person, they're just fascinated and thirsty for the truth, for the information we're providing, to tell them and comfort them and their children and their grandchildren that there is no climate crisis. And that's the story that we like to use. In fact, we did focus group effort last year, and that's the takeaway we had from the focus groups, where the people respond to a positive message. And that's what we do, sticking to the science and staying away from the politics. I'll leave that part up to you because you're so good at it. But we stick to the science, and we're proud to promote the truth of what's going on. Again, I'm hugely optimistic that so many people here in America are thirsty for this information. Now, Mark, I'll be leaving in 3 weeks. My new book's being published in Dutch. I'll be doing it'll be European, mainly Netherlands book tour, producing. I'll be attending there with Clintel annual meeting, and we'll be pushing my book and doing interviews and presentations all over the Netherlands. And it's this kind of information we need to get out. This is a global problem, and it's one that we need to get the information, the truth on.
Well, speaking of that politics angle, in Europe, the politicians, and I've read that there's a thing called the UK Fires report, came out 2019. It's calling for like 80% reduction in meat eating, closures of new airports, regulating CO2 as similar to asbestos. I read the House of Lords transcripts of that, the political side of this, and not a single member of the House of Lords in the UK challenged the premise. And they all basically said, well, it went a little too far, but of course, climate's a problem. How do we translate? And I think you're right. Here's where I think we disagree. You're definitely more optimistic than me, but I agree with you that the public is. Major polling last week showed that there's 10% drop in people concerned about climate change in just a couple of years. So your work is having a huge impact. I agree with you, but when it comes to the politics, doesn't seem to be trickling, because all throughout Europe, Canada, I was just talking about the main opposition to Justin Trudeau. They all accept there's a climate crisis and that we need solutions, just like Benji. How do we translate your message of the science? You're doing a great job with people, but how do we get politicians, more and more politicians, to stand up and reframe that narrative?
Well, we're using that's a tough nut to crack, Mark. It's how
Yeah.
do we do that? What we're doing here at the CO2 Coalition, we're doing state specific and region specific reports on climate change. And we can just point to Wyoming as one example where we created a report on Wyoming and its climate. And we saw that the title was Wyoming and Climate Change. Carbon dioxide should be celebrated, not captured, because the Republican governor of Wyoming is pushing. He wants to take the West. He wants to make it negative net zero. He wants to decarbonize the West. And just think about that. Doug Burgum from North Dakota, Kristi Noem from South Dakota, and they've all signed on to this nonsense. And I think what we've
Yeah.
done in Wyoming, we went out and testified before the Senate. And a week after we came back, we had a team of scientists, Dr. Happer, Dr. Sapoyan, and myself went out there. And a week later, that same Senate voted to strip $257 million out of the Governor Gordon's Green Energy Fund. And they credited the work that we did there in the reports and the science. And what we saw was in Wyoming, like in many areas around the United States, we saw that the heat waves and maximum temperatures peaked 90 years ago during the 1930s. And in Wyoming, we saw that percentages of days above 100 degrees has been falling for 80 and 90 years, not increasing. They claimed that we'd see the end of snow and the ski resorts were going to disappear. We looked at 8 different ski resorts to find that 6 of the 8 were increasing in snowfall in inches per year over the last 30 years. And we see things, we can look at that. They're predicting that wildlife would be disappearing and going extinct or endangered. And we took a look at the wildlife across Wyoming to find that each one of these mammals they're predicting terrible things for is actually increasing. And so what we find looking around at each one of these messages, again, ecosystems, endangered species, they're all doing better, not worse. But that doesn't, they need to spread this and create this climate of fear. So people will gladly, if there is an existential threat to the earth, well, of course we should do something about it. We just don't see that being supported with the science.
Well, and what you're doing is where the rubber meets the road, because you're influencing directly politicians in charge of this climate policy. And I love that. I love to hear that, especially when you present the science at a key moment and it actually has legislative results. That's impressive. So the question then, we're going back to the youth movement, how do we get this message? Because one of the things driving the idea of we have to accept this and come up with solutions is this idea that young people believe it, and people are going to lose their votes, and politicians are susceptible. Oh, I need to worry about that. I can't be a climate denier. How do we educate the young people? How do we deprogram propaganda from elementary school through college on climate?
We're trying here at the CO2 Coalition. We've got an education initiative where we've created books, comic books, and lesson plans or videos, and each one of these has a lesson plan to go with it. We're actually getting these into some of the public schools, particularly in Texas. We've had 2 systems reach out for us. They love that our lesson plans are created by scientists. Dr. Sharon Camp, AP Science reader, AP Science teacher. So we take painstaking detail to make sure that the lesson plans we provide are quality. We'll be traveling to Florida next week to go to the Florida Parent-Teacher Conference. It's the largest homeschool conference in the world, actually. We'll be there with a double booth presenting our materials, including these comic books that we've got. We've got a talented artist down in Brazil that works full-time for us. Just wonderful, captivating artwork that are in these books. The kids just love it. And we've seen people we just shipped a whole shipment to a large charter school in Oregon, and they loved our material. So we're getting it out there. It's a tough road to hoe getting this into the public schools, but we're starting to be successful. And we just really rolled this out less than a year ago. It's at the CO2learningcenter.com is to get the information there. And I've got a new book, a children's book that I just wrote. It's called Chloe the Clownfish Sleeps Well at Night. And so we're able to take a clownfish that lives on the Great Barrier Reef and say she's scared. She went to school and learned that her reef was going to be destroyed. And we use this as a vehicle then to bring in the science. I recruited Dr. Peter Ridd, one of the top reef experts in the world. He and I worked together on this to get the science right about what's actually happening to Chloe and the other animals that live on the Great Barrier Reef. And we find the Great Barrier Reef isn't being destroyed. It's actually thriving and prospering, completely opposite of what we've been told.
All right, we're talking with Gregory Wrightstone, the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, author of A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. We take a break. We'll be right back with more of Gregory Wrightstone after these messages. Stay tuned.
We come from a long line of farmers, and there's a sense of pride with being part of these multi-generational businesses. But there's also a significant amount of pressure. My senior year of high school, my dad made the decision that this world no longer needed him in it. I don't know if he was overwhelmed by the bills and checks that weren't going to be coming in because of the strawberries dying off, but it breaks my heart that my dad made a permanent decision for a temporary issue. Don't feel like you have to go through it alone.
Farmers have to take care of their physical and their mental health, because what's a farm without a farmer?
In the mornings, that's my time. Watching the sun come up, I can have a cup of coffee and exercise if I want to. It helps me start the day with a sense of gratitude.
Yay!
Every day is a new opportunity. Don't forget to check in on yourself. Love your mind. We come from a long line of farmers, and there's a sense of pride, but there's also a significant amount of pressure.
Farmers have to take care of their physical and their mental health, because what's a farm without a farmer?
Watching the sun come up, that's my time. I can have a cup of coffee, and every day is a new opportunity.
That's cool. Your hand's gotten so Yay!
Don't forget to check in on yourself. Love your mind.
From wars to censorship to cultural issues, you're with Marc Morano and Unleashed on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to Unleashed with Marc Morano on TNT. We're talking with Gregory Wrightstone, the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, author of A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. All right. We have right now we're in a presidential year. And it looks like polling for climate is not going well for the Democrats. But Joe Biden is strongly considering declaring a national climate emergency, which would give him wartime powers. Center for Biological Diversity says it gives him 130 executive wartime powers by which to bypass democracy. He'll be able to, we have the German transport minister 3 weeks ago floating the idea of a weekend car ban travel in order to meet their net zero goals. How do we, you're on the front lines of this. You're fighting on the science, you're talking to state legislators, politicians, you're touring Europe. How do we fight this idea of the climate emergency? And let's reverse the question. If we did face one, is there anything politicians could do to stop it? So you'll forget about what would have theoretically caused it or whether we have one. Is there a way? I don't even know what they want us to do. They essentially say if you shut down free enterprise, that somehow the climate will benefit and we can prevent an emergency. We need more central planning. Where does this come from? I mean, how do they even get away with this? Yeah, on the ground, what are you finding?
Yeah, we find, we take a look when we go into these states, we take a look actually what would happen, how much warming would be averted if they did go to net zero. And we find that it's actually in the thousandths of a degree Fahrenheit of temperature warming that would be averted. It's an incredibly small amount. And it's amazing hubris for people to think that the CO2 is the control knob of the temperature of the atmosphere and we control the CO2. But in fact, that's just not the case. We need to advance this idea of the huge benefits of warming and more CO2.
Well, you have people like NASA's lead scientist Gavin Schmidt, who says that anyone basically that if climate skeptics, what was the phrase he used, that they were sociopaths. So you have the top global warming scientist at NASA. I don't say top, I mean the guy in charge, not necessarily he's got the best credentials because he doesn't. But essentially, why all the name calling? Why the demonization? Why do they call us climate deniers? You had the CBS, Scott Pelley said he won't interview a climate denier for CBS News for the same reason he won't interview a Holocaust denier. What is going on? Why are they so threatened by you and your scientific presentation?
Because if I showed them the facts, the science, the data that shows the deserts are shrinking, that forests, we're not experiencing deforestation, we're experiencing reforestation. We can march through this entire litany of heat wave increases. No, we can march through their litany that rising temperatures were going to kill millions of people. Just the opposite is occurring. We have 15 to 20 times as many people die from cold as from heat. What does that tell me? It tells me that global warming saves lives, because we would save millions of people an early, untimely death from cold-related issues. And they're warning us too of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. And that's from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, guess what? It's already warmed 1.2 degrees. So what they're really warning us about is 0.3 of a degree Celsius, half a degree Fahrenheit. We can't let it get that warm or it's all over. Well, it's probably warmed up or cooled down in your studio just as we started talking, more than that. And if you're that worried about it, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, move 19 miles further north and your average temperature will be reduced by half a degree Fahrenheit. When you think, if we're able to get out there and tell people this information about how corn is a great example, it has just been exploding across. This is the greatest crop, biggest crop in the world. It's breaking records year after year. It's a tremendous story. We can tell the story of sea level rise that's increasing. I hope you are sitting down good, because it's increasing at 7 inches per century. It's not accelerating. We can look at the Maldive Islands to find out that they're just above sea level, the most at-risk island nation chain in the world. And 15,000 years ago, the Maldives were also just above sea level. But since that time, sea level has risen 400 feet. Why are the Maldives and the other islands not under 400 feet of water? It's because of a geologic process known as accretion. And so what they're warning us about is within the next several decades, the Maldives will be underwater. Well, you know what? That's about 2.5 inches of sea level rise. So the last 400 feet of sea level rise didn't put them underwater. But that next 3 inches, look out. Well, heck, that's barely above your ankles. It might not even be above your ankles. And they're warning. I think they're actually their own worst enemy, because everything unusual, unprecedented, something strange, lots of rain, no rain, too much snow, not enough snow. They attribute it to man-made climate change. And I think people are wise to it. They've seen these instances of linking climate change to increased toenail fungus, for crying out loud. They link it to everything is now back and attributed to climate change, as if this has never happened before. We see too that the fires are 20% of what they were 90 years ago. It's not, we're seeing a decrease in both number and area burned of fires. Hurricanes, even the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change agrees that there's no documented increase in hurricanes. And I think you and I can agree that we would argue, I think, that there's been a slight decrease in hurricane activity. But what they do is this is the trick they use for hurricanes. And it is true. They'll claim that there's been an increase in named hurricanes. Yep, there sure has. They're naming the hurricanes earlier. What used to be a tropical depression now gets a name, so they can claim and be truthful that named hurricanes are increasing. Well, if you start naming them early, when there's just a tropical depression, you're going to get more named hurricanes.
And isn't that true of tornadoes? Doesn't Al Gore say we've never counted this many tornadoes? But isn't that because of better technology to be able to count them? What we would have missed in earlier decades?
It is. Tornadoes and hurricanes are both difficult. I mean, hurricanes for long range analysis, going back to 1850, say, it's difficult because a lot of these hurricanes rose up in the Atlantic or typhoons in the Pacific and dissipated and no one knew about it. So I like using landfalling hurricanes in the United States here, because if a hurricane makes landfall from the mid 1800s on, you're going to know it. It's hard to avoid not knowing when a hurricane makes landfall. So we know every single hurricane that's made landfall, and it's been in decline. And same with tornadoes. Before Doppler radar came into being and the stations were set up, there were a lot of tornadoes that touched down in the middle of nowhere, of Podunk, Iowa, Kansas, and no one knew about it. But now with Doppler radar, we can measure those. And again, with tornadoes, if we just look at the big ones, the F3, F4, F5 tornadoes, it's most likely those we captured. Somebody knew about that. So we can take that back to the early 1900s for the really big tornadoes. But in the Doppler era, we see the tornadoes definitely have increased. And we see that severe weather, extreme weather events also, this is UN data I'm talking about, are decreasing. And definitely severe weather related deaths have just fallen by over 90% since the early 1900s. And these are things that's why they don't have you and me, Will Happer, and the others that are out there talking sense. That they can't have us on, because we provide fascinating, easy understood data that counters this climate crisis narrative.